Welcome, everyone, to the Don't Panic, It's Just Data podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Wayne Eckerson. I'm the president of Eckerson Group, a boutique consultancy specializing in data and analytics strategy and design for both commercial and nonprofit organizations around the world. Today, I am speaking with Ben Schaechter, co-founder and CEO of Vantage, about optimizing network traffic costs with Vantage's network flow reports. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, Wayne. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here and have the conversation.
Terrific. Well, let's dive right in. Can you walk us through how network flow reports function and why they've become such a game changer for cloud management?
Yeah, so network flow reports essentially give the customer on AWS the ability to ingest VPC flow log data, which is the unmetered kind of raw network traffic data, and normalize that with the cost data. And the reason why this is so helpful is that when you look at the cost data on AWS just in its most basic form, it will just show you, here's the cost of egress out, or here's the cost from one data center to another. But it doesn't really show you which resource or which VPCs or which applications are actually driving that cost. So it can be a little bit of a black box for what's actually causing that traffic. Using Vantage's VPC flow log integration through network flow reports, we ingest all of that data, we normalize it by cost instead of traffic flow, and then it gives you the specific resources that are driving that cost. So essentially it helps with this cost debugging story of what are the actual resources or applications or services driving the costs to pinpoint to an engineer on the team, what is the actual thing that I need to go and remediate. So to kind of distill that down, so normally to an engineer, they would be given a set of cost data. They would be given a problem that is just showing, here's the amount of costs that are going egress out, or here's the amount that is going cross AZ. Whereas using network flow reports on Vantage, they can pinpoint the exact resource or the exact application that's driving that specific cost. So that's kind of a summary of how the product works.
Yeah, so you're offering a heck of a lot more granularity into how companies are using the AWS resources and what they're getting charged for. So I assume that this is going to have a huge impact on how they use the infrastructure, right? So maybe you could give us some examples of how it's empowering teams to make smarter decisions about resource allocation and cost optimization.
For sure. There's a number of examples that we've already had kind of organically in the wild amongst our customer base. The nice thing is that most of these enterprises already have VPC flow logs enabled for security purposes, for audit purposes. And so even opting into the product, if there is a cost spike from a network perspective, the data is there, they can enable it, and then immediately go into Vantage to diagnose what went awry. So let's take an example of something that happened recently. There's actually two great examples that have happened recently. The first example is, let's say that you're an AWS customer and you are using an exterior service like Datadog, Snowflake, Databricks, basically anything where you are sending traffic out to the internet. Using network flow reports, Vantage can also do lookup of the IPs or destinations for traffic flows outside of AWS. And we had a customer recently that someone on their team had put a new configuration in place on the AWS side that was driving up significant egress traffic out and costs out. And so they went to look at their bill. They, in the raw bill form, just see that their costs are going up. And then question number one is, why is this happening? What is actually causing this? They integrated the VPC flow logs into Vantage, which allows them to create network flow reports. And within about an hour of that being enabled, they could see the exact resources that were, in this case, driving significant egress out to logging on Datadog. And then on Vantage, it shows, here are the specific EC2 instances. Here's the specific applications that are driving this traffic. They can make a configuration update on the AWS side that ultimately significantly reduced the costs associated with that configuration. The other recent example is for someone who is all in on AWS. There's a number of different charges that AWS kind of incurs on like a network traffic basis. That's honestly a bit of a joke in the industry or meme in the industry for just how complicated it is. And there is a different rate for egress out for each data center. And then there's a different rate for traffic kind of transiting from one data center to another. And depending upon the data center or the region that you're going to, it's like colloquially referred to as cross AZ. This is where you can have significant kind of cross AZ data transfer costs. So same story. The customer had the VPC flow logs in their account. They enabled it. And then on Vantage, they saw that they just had a misconfiguration where they could update various network configurations on the AWS side that prohibited the traffic going from a cross AZ perspective, and they reduced their network traffic costs by 90%. So those are two significant cases. And for both of those cases, they were able to pinpoint these are the specific resources on AWS that were actually emanating those costs. Or if they went and looked at the billing console or the raw cost data, you would just see, here's a bucket of costs, but I don't actually know what's driving it.
So the network flow reports, just to clarify, they're geared towards data engineers, application engineers. Who's the target audience?
So the typical user is a DevOps engineer, a network engineer, basically anyone who is responsible for configuration changes on the AWS side. So to speak through the data that you get, for anyone who's familiar with like a Sankey diagram or like a flow chart, essentially what you'll be able to see is on the left-hand side, you will see all of the resources as a column. So EC2 instances or NAT gateways, basically anything that's like a network compatible resource. And then you can see on the right side, and you can actually also configure this, you can do a flow chart for egress or ingress. You can see if it's going egress out. You can see what the peer resource ID is. Long story short, it is for engineers to go and diagnose what's happening in their infrastructure to remediate those costs. So the typical flow would be, someone from finance might say, hey, you're over budget. They will talk to CTO, VP of Eng, who will task their team with investigating this. And then the ultimate users of the network flow reports are embedded within that technical organization. And usually it's someone on the infrastructure engineering side.
Yeah, so you're making heroes of some of these engineers, right? Maybe you could step back a little bit and talk about the larger context of what's going on in the industry to make people very focused on managing costs in AWS. Are organizations as a whole having trouble containing these costs, in your opinion? And therefore, a tool like these network flow reports are just absolutely critical to addressing this challenge?
Yeah, definitely. So just as backdrop on what's happening in market. So if you rewind the clock a little bit and you think back 5-10 years ago, we were kind of in this bull market phase. Everyone was focused on growth. They could focus on revenue and they didn't need to worry about bottom line costs or margin as much. And really what happened kind of around the time of COVID was the markets started having a little bit more pressure on top line. The market started to correct. And as a result, companies who had previously had the luxury of focusing on growth had to go and look at their bottom line costs. And what's interesting is for a large percentage of companies out there, there's kind of two bulk costs. The first one is people. And, you don't really want to lay off people or let go of people if you don't need to. And the second cost for many companies is infrastructure costs. And if you think about it, some of these companies are all in on public cloud. Their costs of goods sold are in certain cases, entirely AWS or Datadog or some of these other infrastructure providers like Azure, Google Cloud. And infrastructure costs are also interesting in that you can take measures to reduce those costs without actually impacting your production workloads, which is a little bit different from a lot of things in the world, right? If you want to decrease your electrical bill, sure, there might be some efficiencies, but usually you're turning stuff off. Whereas on public cloud, you can make commitments. You can simply make a commitment. You can reduce your spend as a result of that commitment by 20, 30, 40%. So it can be significant savings, even if there are no actual impact to your production workflows. So what we've seen is really since that kind of like fall of 2022 timeframe, there being significant inbound for tools in this space. There's been I call it kind of like the 2008 moment for public cloud, where 2008, everyone kind of changed the way that they were thinking about underwriting mortgages. And now I think organizations are changing the way that they're thinking about their public cloud spend. It's just kind of the new normal. And the result of this is that if you look at these organizations, they are actually staffing FinOps or cloud economics teams. These are official titles. If you go to LinkedIn, it's usually about 2 to 5 people at an organization that are responsible just for the optimization of those costs that are working in conjunction with everyone else in the organization. The other thing that's happened during this time frame is that there's just a lot more providers in market. So where before you might have only used AWS, now you're using things like Datadog, Databricks, MongoDB Atlas, Fastly, Snowflake, and there's just a lot more complexity with these production workloads. So I'll go ahead and pause there, but that's kind of like the verbose answer on what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Of course, I have a few more years in the industry than you, so I go back even further to the time where we spent a lot of time focusing on, what was the peak processing capacity that you needed your in-house servers to support, right? And that's where all the, the financial calculations and analysis and evaluation went before you bought the hardware, right? You needed to make sure you bought enough hardware. But since the migration to the cloud, that whole evaluation has moved. And initially, I think as organizations migrated to the cloud, we didn't have these tools like network flow reports to help them manage that infrastructure and make those critical financial decisions that end up being potentially millions of dollars, right? So it is interesting how things have evolved both from on-premise to cloud and then within the cloud from, revenue generation to now cost efficiency, as you said.
Exactly. And actually, to your point, the other thing that's interesting about this is if you think about when organizations have their own on-prem data centers, that is a fixed CapEx cost. You pay for your equipment and you don't have any variable costs as it relates to traffic in most cases, definitely not for intra data center, right? And then as these organizations move to public cloud, they go from a CapEx fixed rate cost to an OpEx variable cost that has different consumption rates for, every single SKU that you use. And then there's really 3 things that you're paying for. There's compute, there's storage, and there's network. And network is by far the most obscure in terms of what is actually driving those costs. And so that's what Network Flow Reports actually supports.
It's interesting. Yeah. So for businesses adopting these types of reports, what kind of tangible benefits like operational efficiency or cost savings should they anticipate? Can you give them kind of a ballpark estimate of, how much they're going to save once they implement your tool?
Yeah, so there's kind of a series of things that they can do from a practitioning perspective that can have a pretty dramatic impact on the networking portion of the costs for their AWS account. And this is going to sound crazy, but it's actually true that depending upon the configuration change, you actually have the ability to reduce the rate of your costs for certain applications by 90%.
Wow.
And to speak through this, there's different flows on AWS that are free. You don't have to pay anything. And then there are certain flows on AWS that are metered by the traffic flow. And if you have a misconfiguration, things can kind of blow up pretty quickly. And these are, in certain cases, very quick fixes. And so there's kind of 2 different aspects to these reports. One is that using the cost reporting functionality on Vantage, you can get an anomaly detected. And this anomaly can be alerted for a specific service or business unit or function. You can customize these reports. And the typical flow will be someone on your team, especially in a large organization. This could be one engineer of 1,000. Put out a misconfiguration. The system will automatically alert for an anomaly, a cost overrun that's occurred. You can go and investigate which resource using Network Flow Reports drove that, update the configuration. And in certain cases, it actually just reduces the cost to 0 right there if you were able to move that flow to one of these free traffic flows on Vantage. The second thing I'll say just super quick is that everything on Network Flow Reports is normalized in terms of cost instead of traffic. So we drop all the free traffic and then just show you here are the specific pain points for what's actually driving costs. And it can actually be that a minority portion of your traffic is driving, in certain cases, 90 to 100% of your costs. And then it gives you the ability to go in and kind of diagnose it very kind of right off the bat.
Yeah, I've heard that you need to be really smart, or at least not stupid, to manage your costs in the cloud regarding infrastructure and even data platforms, right? And doing simple things like turning things off when you don't need them is a very common thing in the data side to save costs and save money, as well as writing more efficient queries. But you're also saying the same thing on the network side. It's like, okay, don't use that expensive flow or service, use this free service, right? So it's doing these common sense things that people just oftentimes don't look at or overlook in the rush to get something up and running.
Definitely. And this is kind of the rise of FinOps, right? It is the ability for engineers to first and foremost get visibility on or see their costs, whereas in a lot of cases, they're just flying blind, right? You may not know otherwise that you're driving up these costs. And then when engineers are given these tools to be able to see a cost metric alongside all of the other metrics that they're looking at, naturally they tend to take better behavior towards remediating that. So Vantage, it's kind of in our name, getting a good view on your costs and associated infrastructure. And then Network Flow Reports kind of gives that specific network view there.
Now, earlier you said that in the cloud, there are three types of costs. There's processing, there's storage, and there's networking. So your product focuses just on that last piece, right? The network flow?
Yeah, the platform actually handles everything wall to wall within not just AWS, but 15 different providers. And so we're the market leader for the number of native integrations that we support. And some of those names are names that I called out. So AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, but then we also support we actually just launched GitHub support in the last week. It's been one of the faster growing providers that we support. But other names like Snowflake, Databricks, Datadog, MongoDB Atlas, basically anything with a consumption-based pricing model is something that we support. With Network Flow Reports, it's basically when a customer connects their AWS account to Vantage, they will be able to see compute, they will be able to see storage, they will be able to see actually support for hundreds of different AWS services. The Network Flow Reports is actually a layer across all of those different services within AWS. So you'll be able to see your network costs for any network-enabled resource on AWS. And the more common ones that we hear are EC2 instances or NAT gateways or internet gateways, basically anything that has like a networking cost at the end of the day. So it's essentially like a module within the greater platform that gives you visibility on things from a network perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, FinOps is where it's at these days. So it sounds like having your product is instrumental for anyone who wants to constrain costs on these new cloud platforms. So thank you, Ben, so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. Also, thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot away from today's podcast. For further information on what we've talked about, please head over to vantage.sh. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head over to em360tech.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Wayne.